So 1st of January, you're probably expecting a real blockbuster of a message this morning. Maybe a Sean special or some Matthew magic to kick off the new year right. Instead you've got me. For that I can only apologise in advance and also suggest that if we're lucky, it's part of some master strategy to reset the bar of sermon quality to a new low, a baseline, so that from here out through 2017 things can only get better and we'll all benefit from some sort of faith crescendo at the tail end of the summer. If that is the plan, I think I'm uniquely qualified to execute it. So I'm going to pray and then I'll go ahead and deliver a message of quite dubious quality. half joking. Jesus, your Bible talks continually about love. You tell us that you are love, and you encourage us to love you and to love one another. And it's abundantly clear that this notion, this concept of love is central to who you are and who we're meant to be. So this morning, God, as we look at what John has to say about love, help us to understand his message and teach us something new, God, that we can take into our day-to-day lives. Amen. The good news is this is going to be a pretty simple message, very appropriate for New Year's Day. John, when he writes in a simple, punchy style. He also has a habit of circling back and making the same point 2 or 3 times to reinforce it. I'm sure you'll hear some of the same repetition from me, more out of accident than by design, but it's going to be a simple message. So if you were up a little bit later than normal last night, or if you enjoyed and lived life to the full a little bit more than normal last night, and you're feeling either tired or fragile this morning, don't worry, you should be able to keep up. We're in a series working through the book of 1st John, and today we're going to be looking at chapter 3, the second half of it, verses 11 to 24. So we'll go ahead and read those top to bottom now. John says, "For this is the message you have heard from the beginning. We should love one another. Do not be like Cain, who belonged to the evil one and murdered his brother. And why did he murder him? Because his own actions were evil and his brothers were righteous. Do not be surprised, my brothers and sisters, if the world hates you. We know that we have passed from life to death because we love each other. Anyone who does not love remains in death. Anyone who hates a brother or sister is a murderer, and we know that no murderer has eternal life residing in him. This is how we know what love is. Jesus Christ laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for our brothers and sisters. If anyone has material possessions and sees a brother or sister in need, but has no pity on them, how can the love of God be in that person? Dear children, let us not love with words or speech, but with actions and in truth. This is how we know that we belong to the truth and how we set our hearts at rest in his presence. If our hearts condemn us, we know that God is greater than our hearts and he knows everything. Dear friends, if our hearts do not condemn us, we have confidence before God and receive from him anything we ask, because we keep his commands and do what pleases him. And this is his command, to believe in the name of his Son, Jesus Christ, and to love one another as he commanded us. The one who keeps God's commands lives in him and he in them. And this is how we know that he lives in us. We know by the Spirit he gave us." When I first read this passage a couple of weeks ago, starting to prepare for this morning, I was concerned that it was not really telling us much that we didn't already know. At first pass, my only real takeaway was that John is saying we're to love one another. And that's a message we've heard time and again. It's pretty intrinsic to us. And I think John even admits as much. He starts the passage by saying, "For this is the message you've heard from the beginning." And in a biblical sense it is. Right back in Deuteronomy, Moses starts to talk about love when he commands, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength." And that message of love is repeated again and again through the Bible, right into the New Testament. If I was to pick one verse that I think summarizes this whole passage, it would be from John 15, where Jesus says, "My command is this, love each other as I have loved you. Greater love has no one than this. They lay down one's life for one's friends." So clearly love is central to the Bible, and I think it's central to our ordinary lives, the lives of non-Christians as well. We talk about love all the time. It's part of who we are. It's part of our experience. You'll hear me say, on an almost daily basis things like, I love my wife, I love my kids, I love POW days, I love beer, I love bacon, I love dogs, I love Donald Trump. Just kidding, making sure you're still with me. And so if love is so much a part of our life, part of our world, you could ask the question, why is there a need for a message like this? Why does John circle back to love in this passage? And I think the answer is because although we may be very cognizant of love, we may pay lip service to it, and we may know something about what it is, we do a very poor job of actually living out the Bible's message of love. You could dispute that if you like, but statistically, 50% of marriages end in divorce. So the fact right there is that at least half of the time we do a poor job of loving our spouses. To bring things into a micro level for a second, if I asked you to think of the last time you had an exchange, a conversation with someone that had elements that were unloving in it, so some anger, some animosity, some jealousy in that conversation, you probably don't have to think back very far. Some of you, it may be several weeks. Congratulations, you're way better people than I am. Many of you, it would be a few days, and for some of you, you'd be thinking to the conversation you had in the car on the way to church this morning. It's normal. We act in unloving ways all the time. You could blast that out and look at a community level, divided communities. You could look at warring nations. You could look at the church. Not this church, of course. Mountainside is pretty much perfect. But the church in general, I think you could make a compelling argument that the church in North America does a really good job of turning up on a Sunday and singing along to great worship music, and a much poorer job of actually living out Jesus' message of love. And I think John identified the same thing in the early church. He knew that the early church was doing a poor job of that as well. And so he wrote this letter. He wrote it to encourage the churches to prioritize love, to think about what love is, what it means. And more than that, very helpfully, he contains in this passage some really practical advice, I think, to help us actually walk into a more loving life. So in the interest of keeping today really simple, I'm going to extract 5 conclusions about love from John's words, and we're just going to talk through those 5 conclusions. First one is that love comes at a cost. And John uses the example of 2 siblings, a pretty extreme example of sibling rivalry, to make this point. I think he does it because brothers and sisters should naturally at least have some capacity to love one another. I have one sister, Claire, and I would characterize our relationship for the most part as loving. It's had its moments. When we were 8 and 9, I managed to remove one of her front teeth with the business end of a walking stick. She retaliated, I think unintentionally, some weeks later by luring me to put my hand at high velocity through a plate glass window, severing an artery and putting me in hospital. Revenge was pretty sweet for Claire. But we haven't come close to murder, like the example that John flags here, the example of Cain and Abel. You're probably familiar with that story. 2 brothers, sons of Adam and Eve. We read about them in Genesis. And the quick and dirty version is that both Cain and Abel make an offering, a sacrifice offering to God. And God accepts and is pleased with Abel's offering and is dismissive and rejects Cain's offering. And that really symbolizes their lives. It symbolizes Abel, who had a life that was God-centered. He was in a good relationship with God, trying to live out of God's goodness. And Cain was quite the opposite. He was distant from God and leading a life that was rooted in evil. And when John shows us this example, he ends it by saying, Cain reacts to Abel's offering being accepted the only way he knows how, which is out of jealousy, out of hatred, and he ends up killing his brother. And I think John's trying to tune our minds to powerful contrasts here, some pretty black and white contrasts between life with God, life without God, between good and evil, between life and death, and between love and hate. And I think he's trying to show us that in our overall life path and in individual situations and scenarios, we can act out of love or we can act out of hate. And you may say that's an obvious choice. I'm not a hater, I would act out of love, that seems natural to me. You may also say that, by the way, that this verse doesn't apply to me, it speaks of murder. I'm not a murderer, I'm never going to be a murderer. But just one small caveat, Matthew 5 says, you shall not murder, anyone who murders will be subject to judgment. But I tell you that anyone who is angry with a brother or sister will be subject to judgment. And so I think you can read this passage and really trade out the word murder for anger, hate, jealousy, all of those negative emotions that we all display far too often. And so it really does apply to us. But the interesting point to me is that John says it's not as straightforward a choice as you might think, because choosing love comes with a cost. He says, don't be like Cain, don't be a murderer, but don't be surprised if the world hates you. He's really saying you can either be the one doing the hating, or you can be the one getting hated on. And that's not a pleasant choice. In fact, it seems like a biblical version of that game, Would You Rather? You know, that game you may play on a long car journey when you ask silly questions like, would you rather have a foot-long nose or a foot-long tongue? The classic, would you rather fight 100 duck-sized horses or one horse-sized duck? Or this one, for some reason, tickled me as I Googled examples. Would you rather fart popcorn or have your past and future web browsing history available to everyone? In the poll I was reading, 75% of people opted to fart popcorn. Which really speaks to our web behavior. And I think that's really what John's saying here. He's saying love is the right choice. It's the obvious choice. But if you want to try and lead a life that mimics biblical love, understand that that's not going to be easy. That's not going to be an easy path. Go into that choice with your eyes open. Second thing that John concludes is that love has a source. If in those opening verses he started to suggest that love comes at a cost, he slams that home in verse 16 when he says, this is how we know what love is. Jesus Christ laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for our brothers and sisters. This is John getting as pointed as John gets and saying, it's not just at a cost. Look at Jesus' example. He paid the ultimate price. He laid down his whole life. And we're meant to do the same thing. He's starting to talk about not just love at a cost, but sacrificial love. And that's not at all natural to us. We have an inbuilt propensity to love and a desire to be loved. But left to our own devices, those two things I don't think are mutually exclusive. In fact, they're absolutely linked. We gravitate to loving the things that have the ability to love us back. So we choose to love within our family units because love should be mirrored there. We pick friends and friendship groups that are compatible and are going to give us some affection back. We even start to pour love into possessions and activities because those things have the ability to provide some kind of pseudo-love back to us when they build us up and massage our ego and make us feel better about ourselves. Sacrificial love that doesn't ask for anything in return, that is given with no strings attached, no caveats, is quite unnatural to us the way we're wired. My 3-year-old boy has a limited and quite narrowly focused capacity to love because he's 3. He tends to focus on the things of the moment and pour his affection into those. For the most part, that's fine and understandable, but there's a point in almost every day where it becomes grating. That point is normally towards the end of the afternoon, fatigue setting in, and he's focusing on the one thing he wants, whatever that may be, and just pestering us for it. So it may be a snack. Can I have a snack, Dad? Can I have a snack? And we'll say, no, dinner's coming up, no snack, but that doesn't work, so we need to go further, and we need to employ that classic parenting technique of distraction. We say, forget about the snack, why don't you play with your toys? And if we're lucky, for a number of minutes, he'll get focused on his toys and absorb there. It's never more than a few minutes, because pretty quickly he'll choose a toy that his brother wants to play with, and some sort of toddler meltdown is on our hands. So then we go into overdrive with distraction, and we play the trump card. Weston, how about a little TV? That's always a great saviour. And we'll put him on the couch and we'll turn the TV on and we'll enjoy the best half an hour of our day. We can have adult conversation. We can actually get on with life. And it never lasts about more than 30 minutes, because then we get convicted with the fact that maybe we're terrible parents, and we have to go and try and peel Western back off the couch, and Paw Patrol gets switched down, and that process is really difficult. The only way to achieve it is to bribe him with a snack. I tell you that really as a pretty crude, clumsy example of what I think Jesus offers us that allows us to love sacrificially. I think Jesus says, I understand that you look in the world for love in all sorts of places. You pour your love into things that have the ability on some level to love you back, and those things will ultimately disappoint. And he says, instead of that, let me be the source of your love. Come into a relationship with me. Discover how much I love you, how faithful I am to you, how good I am to you, and let me fill you up. Let me meet that need, that intrinsic desire. And in doing so, let me free you to love in unconditional, sacrificial ways that don't ask for something in return. More than that, at the end of this passage, John touches on the Spirit. He says, the one who keeps God's command lives in him and he in them. And this is how we know that he lives in us. We know by the Spirit he gave us. He doesn't really elaborate, John, but you don't have to look far. You can go to Romans 5 that says about the Spirit, God's love has been poured out into our hearts through the Holy Spirit who has been given to us. It's pretty black and white. We enter into a relationship with Jesus. We're filled with his love. We're given the Spirit that is love in our hearts. Both of those first two conclusions are fairly overarching, perhaps scene setting, almost a little bit vague. It's at this point in the passage that I think John really gets practical. He gives us something to take away, something that we could employ in our lives today, tomorrow. Conclusion number 3 is that love involves everyday relationships. John says, verse 17, if anyone has material possessions and sees a brother or sister in need but has no pity on them, how can the love of God be in that person? John goes for the jugular here. He talks about our possessions. And we know we love our possessions. We love our things, our stuff. If I was to ask you what your favorite possession is, you probably have to noodle on that for several minutes, because there's a number of possessions that are vying for top priority. It might be an iPhone, your wedding ring, your bike. Some of you here probably right now trying to think through which of your collection of bikes would qualify as the favorite bike. I'd pick the easy answer. I'd cheat. I'd say my favorite possession. If I could only have one, I'll take my credit card. Then I've got an unlimited line on more possessions, more things. And so John says, part of living out the love that Jesus prescribes is you're going to have to give up some of those possessions. Some of the things that you love are going to become the vehicle by which you love. I think it'd be easy to take this verse and narrow it down to the simple act of charity. The scenario where we leave Fernie and we get on up into Calgary or Vancouver, and within minutes we're confronted by the homeless dude with a sitting cross-legged, scruffy dog on a string and a little card asking for small change, and say that's what John's speaking to. I don't think he's excluding that situation, but I think he's speaking way more broadly. I think John's speaking more broadly in terms of the possessions and the resources we're meant to use and the needs we're meant to meet. And I think he's actually calling us to relationship. I think he's saying that we're meant to identify in those people around us, our families, our friends, our co-workers, what their basic needs are. And not just their physical or financial needs, but their emotional needs, their spiritual needs. We're meant to search those out, meant to understand them, and then we're meant to provide for them using the possessions, the resources that we have and that we're rich in. Not just finances, but our time, our talents. You could pick any number of examples to kind of play that out, but just a couple for reference. I think John's saying that when you're at work and a co-worker makes a mistake that makes your life harder, that mucks things up, that ruins the day, you extend grace, you extend forgiveness, and you move on. I think he's saying that when a roommate or a spouse comes home after having a testing day and you notice they're down, you take time out to listen and then to speak into that situation or not, but to add humor, positivity, whatever they need to turn that day around. I think John would say that if you had a friend that was out of work and you had ways to make connections, to work your network, to try and find work for that friend, you do that, even if that may cost you your reputation if it doesn't work out. I think John is saying that relationships and our everyday relationships are the arena in which we actually work out this message of love. Fourth conclusion is love means getting real. I may be stretching a little bit for this one, I'll admit, because I'm basing this on a single word at the end of verse 18. Verse 18 says, "Dear children, let us not love with words or speech, but with actions and in truth." And admittedly, in verse 19, John goes on to use the word truth to really describe God. He says, this is how we know that we belong to the truth, we belong to God. But I don't think it's too much of a stretch to suggest that John also uses that word truth in a much more basic, literal way to say that we need to employ truth and honesty and be genuine in the way we love. I think you can make that stretch because when you read the whole book of John, one of its kind of central messages is John trying to instruct us on how to live genuine lives as authentic Christians. And so it's really natural for me that he'd layer that in here and say, if you're going to love and love in relationships by meeting needs of the people around you, you need to do that in a genuine way. And I think that message is more relevant for today's society than perhaps it has been previously, because we live in a society that doesn't tend to put a premium on being authentic. In fact, it does the opposite. We tend to build veneer and put up a front, and Facebook is the most obvious example of that. I'm not going to rail on Facebook too hard, that's too much of an easy target, but a study last year suggested that only 20% of what we write on Facebook is true. The other 80% is either a bending of the truth or an outright fabrication. A couple of slides that'll just show that. Here's a post by someone. You'd see this post more or less every day if you have some Fernie friends on Facebook. This chick is sharing a cute photo of her baby and saying, "The light of my life, can't imagine life without my baby, #blessed." If she was being truthful, I think this is how the post would look. "I haven't slept in 3 days, I smell like baby poop." One more example. This next lady is celebrating a new job. "I'm so happy to announce that on Thursday I'll be starting a new chapter of my life as a junior account manager at a marketing firm in Boston." Smiley face, feeling blessed. If she was being truthful, "I could have just texted my close friends and family, but I wanted all of the people I hate, my exes and my distant family, to know that I'm doing great." Winky face, feeling mischievous. And I don't just think it's in the digital realm that we build avatars. We tend to put up a front in the way we dress, the houses we live in, the cars we drive, the friends we put around us, the activities we run after. All of those things are in part an attempt to conform to the identity that we believe we should have, the way we'd like society to see us or we think society should see us. And I think in many cases they're more of a veneer than they are a real true reflection of who we are as people at core. And I don't think that's our fault. I think if you ask most of us, we'd say we'd love to live true, genuine, authentic lives that are really honest and do justice to who we are. Just the culture that we live in makes that hard to do. And I think it has two detrimental effects on the way that we're meant to work out love within relationships. I think it causes us to either shut down or shut up, or both shut down and shut up. By shut down, and I can speak to this because I'm self-admittedly guilty of it, if I have something that's bugging me, an anxiety, a worry, something to work through, and my wife will tell you this in spades, my natural inclination is to switch off. I'm not going to share that. I'm going to shut down, I'm going to internalize it. It's probably some kind of reaction or fear that by putting that out there, I'm going to look weak or vulnerable. So I try and fight that battle internally. And that's not conducive to the type of love that John's talking about here, that Jesus talks about. Because when you shut down like that, you don't allow the people around you to understand what your basic needs are and try and help you and speak into those with love. And more than that, you actually discourage those people around from you from being open and sharing and genuine with you and giving you the opportunity to help them. The second problem, the problem of shutting up, is one where I think we hold back on both how often we try to ask the right questions to identify people's needs, and the advice and feedback we give out of love to try and help people with them. We're afraid often, perhaps not with those closest, but that next circle around, we're afraid to ask the tough questions. What do you think about this? How are you doing with that? The questions that may prompt a conversation that creates emotion, that starts to shatter the perfect veneer that many of us are trying to live up to. And more than that, I think we're afraid often to speak truthfully with really honest, genuine advice that should help people around us if it's delivered out of love. If we can't provide advice that's generic and delivered in 140 characters or less, I think we're loath to give it at all. And so I think when John says, let us love with actions and in truth, he's motivating us to actually have relationships that are open, that involve sharing and transparency and real, genuine honesty. Final conclusion for this morning is that love brings a reward. And if John started this passage by suggesting we had to make a choice between two not particularly attractive would you rather situations, he makes up for that at the end by talking about love and hate and drawing a positive in both of those situations. It took me a bit of time to kind of work through this and pull the meaning that I took out of these couple of lines. But John starts to talk about searching our hearts and determining whether we're acting out of love or out of hate or something that's less than love. And by searching our hearts, I think he's saying, trust your instincts on this. I wish I'd trusted my instincts a little bit more on Christmas Eve when I was doing some recycling, big clear out to the dump before all of the Christmas boxes got opened. And Tara, my wife, had put a number of boxes by the door, including a couple of obviously empty ones on top. So I started sweeping them up and throwing them into the back of the truck. And I came to one, a longer rectangle box that looked markedly less tampered with and open than the others. It was really light. And my instinct told me this probably wasn't a box that should go to the dump. But I was rushing and it was in the pile and it went in the back of the truck and it went to the dump, and I managed to throw out on Christmas Eve my son's present from Grandma, which was brand new Salomon cross-country skis. Never got them back. I should have trusted my instinct. And I think John is saying we should trust our instincts when we reflect on the decisions we make, the actions we take, and whether they're actions and decisions born out of love or not. And I think we're pretty good at this. We intrinsically know, you may say it's the Spirit guiding us, but we intrinsically have a sense of whether we're acting in a way that puts others first, that has elements of the type of sacrificial love that Jesus prescribes, or whether we're acting in ways that put us first, that feed our ego, that are ultimately selfish. And John looks at both of these situations and advises us what to do with them when we reflect on them. First of all, he says, if our hearts condemn us, if we realize that we've been less than loving, then concentrate on the fact that God is greater than our hearts and that he knows everything. And in that one line, John's just driving right at the heart of the gospel. He says, God knows we're all human and that we're going to act and do things that are less than Jesus' perfect loving example all the time, again and again and again. And we should understand that, but we shouldn't beat ourselves up about that. When we have that reflection, we should actually concentrate on God as being bigger than those mistakes, bigger than us, and having a heart so large and so much capacity to love that he erases those mistakes, that he forgives them for us. And John's saying, in those situations, find peace. Have peace that through your relationship with Jesus, you've bought into the greatest insurance policy that was ever written. Then he looks at the other side of the coin and he says, you'll reflect on situations where you did act out of love. And he says in those situations, there'll be some reward. He says, you will have confidence before God and receive anything you ask because you keep his commands and do what pleases him. And I think in those situations, he's saying when we act in loving ways that have our actions aligned with God's intentions for us, he respects that and he honors that, and he opens up his lines of communication, and our relationship with him is going to be strengthened. Our communion with God is going to be taken to new levels. He's going to answer prayer because it's coming from the right place. More than that, he says we're going to have a confidence, and the Greek word used for confidence there is a word parasia, which means more than confidence. It means a courage, a boldness, a complete lack of fear, and particularly with respect to the way we would talk to or communicate with God and talk to others about God. And I think what John's driving at here is that when we actually act in ways that are living out Jesus' loving example, we're starting to live into the identity that God has for us, the core identity. We're moving away from being autonomous, selfish people separated from God, and moving towards being individuals that are in strong communion with our God, acting in ways that he prescribes as being loving. And out of that comes this confidence, this sense that because we're living out of our identity, we can be confident in the way that we approach God, the way that we talk about God, and take that confidence into our lives. So, to summarize, John says that we should lead a loving life and go into that knowing that it's going to come at a personal cost. He says that not just at a personal cost, but our love should be sacrificial. And because that's not normal to us, we need to find Jesus as the source of our love so that we can love without caveat, with no strings attached. He says that our everyday relationships are going to be the arena in which that love plays out, and it needs to be done in a way that's real, that's open, that's transparent. And then he finishes by saying, we're all human. We're all going to do better and worse at that on any given day. And on the days when we're having a hard time with that, concentrate on the fact that that God will forgive us and make that right and fix that. He's not condoning it, but he's saying have peace in that. And he's also saying that there's something to be gained from reflecting on the extent to which you're living out Jesus' example of love, not so that you can be filled up or pat yourself on the back out of that, but because by concentrating on the upside of that, greater communion with God, and actually this stepping into our true identity of acting out of love, we should be motivated to pursue that further. And I think that's true. If we limit our objective for loving to one of it's going to make the lives of those around us better, we're going to affect some positive change, maybe we'll even gain something in the sense that our lives will be better as a result, we're limiting our horizons. To truly understand that really what God's driving at when he advises us and encourages us to do that is he's encouraging us to live into our true identity as his son and as a vehicle of his love. And that motivation should be, I think, a much stronger encouragement to center our lives on that. There'll come a time when we're with God and we'll be completely satisfied and surrounded by his love. And because of that, we'll be able to love perfectly ourselves. That will be called heaven. And until then, we're not going to be able to love perfectly. And we're going to be somewhere on a spectrum. If you can imagine a continuum with Cain the murderer on one end and Abel a little bit further along and Jesus way out the end of that spectrum, we're going to spend our lives somewhere along that spectrum. And John's message, Jesus' example, is saying through life's journey, we're meant to strengthen our relationship with God so that we can move further along that spectrum. And so I'll leave you today with one pretty simple suggestion. It's the season for resolutions. You may have made some this weekend, you may be making some this week. So my suggestion is that alongside losing an extra £10 or trying to make an extra 10 grand. You make it a goal in 2017 to try and move yourself another 10% along that love continuum, wherever you may be. Because I think if we all concentrated on that and did a good job of that in 2017, I think the results would be pretty significant, pretty dramatic. I think we'd see them in our family units. I think we'd see them in our community. I think we'd see them in our church. I think if we all concentrated on that personally, the communal effects of that would be magnified. And more than that, I think we'd benefit from it enormously just on a personal level. If we made part of 2017 about understanding how important sacrificial love is, trying to take to heart some of John's practical advice on how to walk into that, we would find that we became much more fulfilled in terms of living into the role that we were actually born to play. Let's pray. Jesus, I want to thank you for being a God of love, having just an enormous capacity to love us, despite us as mere humans time and again failing to meet up to your high example. I want to thank you for being a forgiving God, a God that understands that predicament and says that you'll make everything right on our behalf. And I want to ask God that as we start to live out the first few days, first few weeks of this new year, that you'll motivate us, that you'll encourage us to see the real benefits of pursuing your example of genuine sacrificial love. Amen.